The flight that changed everything. The day started like any other. Emily adjusted her uniform in the mirror of the airport staff restroom, smoothed out the creases, and took a deep breath. She was used to the routine: boarding, safety announcements, service, and then landing. A flight attendant's life was predictable in many ways, but what happened in between could be anything but. Today, she was assigned to Flight 382, a standard route from New York to Miami. A relatively short trip, just under 3 hours. Easy. Routine. She had done it dozens of times before. The crew was familiar, the captain experienced, and the weather clear. There was no reason for anything to go wrong. But as fate would have it, this was the flight that would change everything. The boarding process. Passengers trickled in, carrying suitcases and personal items, some with tired expressions and others filled with excitement for their destination. Emily stood at the entrance, smiling politely as they passed, greeting each with a rehearsed but genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard." "Good morning, sir." "Ma'am, your seat is just down that aisle." She had done this 1,000 times before. It was second nature. The boarding process was smooth, with only minor hiccups. A passenger with oversized carry-on luggage, another confused about their seat assignment. These were common occurrences. Emily handled them effortlessly, barely sparing them a thought. But then, an elderly woman boarded. She was small and frail, with silver hair neatly tied back into a bun. She moved slowly, gripping the handles of her modest rolling suitcase. Emily watched as the woman hesitated near the entrance, her eyes scanning the rows ahead as if searching for something. "Do you need any help, Mom?" Emily asked, stepping forward. The woman turned to her with a grateful smile. "Yes, dear. My ticket says 14C, but I can't seem to find it." Emily nodded. "Let me help you." She gently guided the woman down the aisle, stopping at her designated row. "Here we are. Let me put that bag up for you." "Thank you," the woman said, settling into her seat. "You're very kind." Emily gave her a professional nod before moving on. It was just another interaction in a long day of work. But she had no idea how important that woman would become. The flight takes off. Once the passengers were settled, the flight attendants went through the safety procedures. Emily barely listened as the lead attendant went through the standard instructions: seat belts, oxygen masks, emergency exits. It was all automatic at this point. Soon, the plane taxied onto the runway, the engines roaring to life as it sped forward, lifting into the sky. Emily, standing near the galley, felt the familiar pressure of takeoff. As the flight leveled out, the routine service began. Carts were wheeled out, snacks and beverages were prepared. Emily moved quickly, serving one row after another. Everything was going smoothly, until that same elderly woman from earlier raised her hand. The first request. Emily noticed her almost immediately. The woman had her hand raised tentatively, her expression calm but expectant. Emily approached with a polite smile. "Yes, Mom. How can I assist you?" "Could I have a glass of water, dear?" the woman asked, her voice soft. Emily glanced at the cart. She had just finished a row and was in the process of refilling supplies. Normally, she wouldn't think twice about fetching a glass of water. It was a simple request, easy to fulfill. But today was different. Her supervisor had been stressing efficiency lately. "Keep the service moving. We don't have time to keep running back and forth for individual requests," they had said during briefing. Emily, wanting to prove herself as a reliable and efficient crew member, had taken those words to heart. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, keeping her voice light. "We're serving drinks in just a few minutes. I'll bring you some then." The elderly woman nodded with understanding. "Of course, dear. No rush." Emily walked away, feeling justified in her response. It was a small delay, nothing major. Or so she thought. The second request. Minutes passed. The beverage cart had moved down the aisle. But Emily found herself caught up in multiple orders. The business class passengers were demanding, special requests, complicated drink mixes, and impatient glances. The flight had a high number of VIP passengers today, and the crew had been instructed to prioritize their needs. By the time Emily passed by row 14 again, she saw the elderly woman raise her hand a second time. Emily felt a twinge of irritation but forced herself to smile as she leaned down. "Yes, Mom. I'm sorry to bother you again," the woman said gently, "but could I please get that glass of water now? I'm feeling a bit parched." Emily hesitated. The cart was still stocked, and the logical part of her mind told her to just hand over the water. But a part of her, one focused too much on the words of her supervisor, on efficiency over empathy, made a different decision. "I'm really sorry, ma'am, but we're still in the middle of service. If you wait just a little longer, I'll get it for you when I come back around." The elderly woman blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right, dear. I understand." Emily gave a quick nod and walked away, trying to shake off the feeling that lingered. Had she just made a mistake? The moment that changed everything. The tension in the cabin was subtle at first. A few passengers had overheard the interaction. Some exchanged glances, others whispered quietly. Emily ignored it. She continued with her duties, focusing on getting through service as quickly as possible. But as she moved down the aisle again, she noticed something troubling. The elderly woman looked uncomfortable. Her face had turned slightly red, and she was shifting in her seat as if trying to ease some kind of discomfort. Her breathing seemed shallow, and she was gripping the armrest with one hand. Something was wrong. Emily hesitated. Then the woman pressed the call button. The sound echoed through the cabin, and Emily felt her stomach tighten. Every flight attendant knew that when a passenger pressed the call button mid-service, it usually meant an urgent need. She turned toward the woman, the weight of her previous refusals pressing against her conscience. She walked over. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked, suddenly feeling the severity of the situation. The woman looked up at her, her eyes filled with something Emily hadn't expected: disappointment. "I'm sorry, dear," the woman said, her voice weaker than before. "But I really need that water now." Emily felt something inside her shift. She had been so caught up in trying to be efficient, in following the rules, that she had forgotten the most important thing about her job: people. She immediately turned toward the galley, grabbed a glass of water, and brought it back. The elderly woman took it with slightly trembling hands, drinking deeply before letting out a relieved sigh. "Thank you," she whispered. It was such a simple thing. And yet when Emily turned, she noticed the cabin had gone completely silent. Passengers had been watching, listening, judging, and they didn't look pleased. A sinking feeling settled in Emily's stomach. And then she heard the voice of her supervisor, Kelly, calling her name. "Emily," Kelly said, her tone sharp. "We need to talk." Emily's breath caught. Something was very, very wrong. And she had a feeling that this conversation was about to change everything. The breaking point. The call that shook everything. Emily's heart pounded as she turned toward Kelly, her supervisor, who stood at the front of the cabin near the galley. There was no warmth in her expression, only the kind of quiet authority that signaled something serious was about to happen. Passengers were still murmuring in low voices, their eyes shifting between Emily, the elderly woman, and Kelly. She swallowed hard. Kelly didn't raise her voice, but her tone was sharp. "Emily, come with me." Emily hesitated. She knew better than to argue in front of passengers, especially when she could already feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She cast one last glance at the elderly woman, who was sipping her water slowly, her frail hands trembling slightly. Then she turned and followed Kelly to the galley, where the noise of the cabin faded behind the thick curtain that separated the flight crew's workspace from the passengers. The second the curtain closed, Kelly spun on her heel to face Emily. "What happened out there?" Her voice was low, controlled, but filled with an unmistakable edge of disappointment. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain that she had been so focused on efficiency that she had ignored a basic request for water? That she had dismissed an elderly woman who was clearly in discomfort? I didn't think it was urgent," she finally said, though even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow. Kelly's eyes darkened. "Not urgent. Emily, you refused to give an elderly passenger a basic necessity. Twice. And not only that, but half the cabin witnessed it." She crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. "Do you have any idea how bad that looks?" Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Passengers had seen. They had talked. She had been so caught up in her own tunnel vision that she hadn't realized how much attention the incident had drawn. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the galley. "I got 2 separate complaints from passengers," said Laura, another senior flight attendant, stepping forward. She wasn't just Kelly's colleague. She was one of the most respected attendants on the airline. If she was involved, it meant the situation had truly escalated. "They said they saw you ignore the woman. And one of them said she looked like she was in distress before you finally gave her the water." Emily's breath hitched. Distress. Guilt clawed at her stomach. She had been too focused on finishing service quickly, on keeping things running smoothly, to really see the woman's discomfort. She pressed the call button. Kelly continued, shaking her head. She shouldn't have had to do that for something as simple as water. Emily bit her lip. I didn't mean to upset her," she whispered. "But you did," Laura said bluntly. "And not just her. The other passengers saw, and they were upset too. Emily, this is serious." For the first time, the weight of her mistake felt unbearable. She had always prided herself on being a good flight attendant. She had worked hard to get here. But now, in a matter of minutes, she had jeopardized everything. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had been following protocol, that she had been overwhelmed by the number of passengers. But deep down, she knew none of those excuses mattered, because at the end of the day, she had failed. Kelly sighed and pulled out her company-issued tablet, tapping a few buttons. "I've already notified the captain about the incident," she said, her tone firm. "And I'm sending in a report to corporate. This is not going to be overlooked." Emily's heart nearly stopped. A report. That meant corporate review, possibly even a disciplinary hearing. She had been hoping this would blow over, that maybe she could fix it before it got out of hand. But now, it was spiraling faster than she could control. Are you taking me off the rest of the flight?" she asked hesitantly. Kelly hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I can't have you serving passengers when they have just seen this happen. Laura will take over your section. You'll stay in the galley and assist with behind-the-scenes tasks only." The shame hit her like a physical blow. Removed from service. It wasn't an official termination, but it felt dangerously close. Emily pressed her lips together, trying to hold back the sting of tears. She wouldn't cry here. Not in front of Kelly. Not in front of Laura. Not in front of her colleagues who probably already saw her as unfit for the job. But the sinking realization was there, gnawing at her from the inside out. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career. And she might not be able to fix it. The cabin reacts. As Emily stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, she could still hear the faint murmur of passengers on the other side of the curtain. Some were still whispering about what had happened. "Did you see how she ignored that poor woman? I can't believe it. A flight attendant, of all people. She should be fired." The words cut deep, sharper than she expected. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, with complaints and tensions on flights, but this was different. This time, she was the one in the wrong. As she stood there, silent and humiliated, she heard someone enter the galley. She turned slightly and saw Laura placing a fresh bottle of water into the beverage cart. Laura paused for a moment before speaking. "You should apologize." Emily swallowed hard. "To who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "To the woman," Laura said, giving her a pointed look. "And to yourself." Emily frowned. Myself. Laura sighed. Emily, you're not a bad person. But you let your pride and the pressure of the job get in the way of doing the right thing. She closed the cabinet door and turned to face her directly. You need to make this right. Not just for the passengers, but for yourself too. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't realized just how much she had been carrying. Her own expectations, the pressure of proving herself, the need to be seen as competent and efficient. But in trying so hard to be perfect, she had forgotten to be kind. She exhaled shakily. You're right, she admitted. Laura nodded. Then go. Emily hesitated for only a moment before pushing the curtain aside. The cabin was still buzzing with conversation, but as she walked down the aisle, some of the murmurs quieted. Passengers noticed her. She could feel their stares. And then she reached row 14. The elderly woman looked up at her kind but tired eyes meeting Emily's. The half-empty cup of water sat in the holder beside her. Emily took a deep breath. I just wanted to say, she began softly, I'm really sorry. The woman blinked, surprised. I should have given you the water when you asked. Emily continued, her voice more steady now. I wasn't thinking, and I let my priorities get mixed up. That was wrong. And I just want you to know that I regret it. For a long moment, the woman didn't say anything. Then she smiled. A small, gentle smile. It's all right, dear, she said quietly. We all make mistakes. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, to her surprise, the woman reached out and patted her hand lightly. Just remember, she said softly, sometimes the smallest kindness can make the biggest difference. Emily nodded. And as she walked back to the galley, she realized that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The consequences and the unexpected lesson. The walk back. As Emily walked back toward the galley after her apology, she could still feel the weight of the cabin's collective gaze on her. The murmurs of passengers hadn't stopped entirely, but they had softened. There was no applause, no immediate shift in their perception of her. Why would there be? She had made a mistake, a big one. And a simple apology, no matter how heartfelt, wouldn't erase that. Still, as she pushed past the curtain and back into the galley, she felt different. Not relieved, exactly, but a little lighter. Like she had taken the first step towards something important. Laura was standing there, arms crossed, watching her closely. Emily wasn't sure what to expect. A lecture. Another reminder of how she had failed. Instead, Laura gave her a single nod. That was the right thing to do. Emily let out a breath. I know. She hesitated, leaning against the counter. I don't know if it made a difference. Laura studied her for a moment before replying. It did. Then, with a small smirk, she added, You just won't feel it right away. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Laura exhaled, looking out toward the curtain, as though she could see the cabin beyond it. When you mess up in this job, it's not about how you feel after apologizing. It's about whether the people you serve believe you mean it, and sometimes, that belief takes time. Emily swallowed hard. You think they'll forget about it? Laura shook her head. No, but they might forgive you. That's not something you can control. All you can do is prove, from this moment forward, that you've learned from it. Emily let those words sink in. She wanted to believe she could fix this, that passengers would see her differently if she just worked harder, if she just tried. But maybe the lesson here wasn't about fixing anything. Maybe it was about growing. The cabin's shift in mood. Back in the cabin, things were different. It wasn't a sudden shift. There was no grand moment where everyone suddenly welcomed Emily back into their good graces. But as the flight continued, something subtle changed. Passengers who had been whispering about her before now seemed less tense. The elderly woman, who had been at the center of the entire incident, was speaking quietly with the man in the seat next to her, sipping what remained of her water. And perhaps most notably, a few passengers who had glared at Emily earlier now met her eyes with something softer. It wasn't quite acceptance, but it wasn't outright hostility either. She had taken a step in the right direction. But the real consequences were still ahead. The final hour of the flight. Emily was still officially pulled from service, but she wasn't completely removed from her duties. Instead, she found herself assisting quietly in the galley, restocking trays, organizing carts, and helping the other flight attendants where she could. It wasn't glamorous work, but she didn't complain. She needed to do something. Kelly and Laura, meanwhile, were speaking in hushed tones near the cockpit. Emily couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could guess. They were discussing her mistake, her fate. She didn't have to wait long for the verdict. Emily. Kelly called after a few moments, motioning for her to step forward. Emily took a steadying breath and walked over. Kelly's expression was unreadable. The captain has been informed of the situation. When we land in Miami, there will be an immediate report sent to corporate. Emily nodded, her stomach tightening. I understand. Kelly studied her carefully. I'm not here to punish you. But I am here to make sure this doesn't happen again. Do you understand how serious this was? Emily nodded again, this time more firmly. Yes, you're not going to be removed from the crew roster just yet, Kelly continued, but expect a meeting with HR. There will be a full review of this incident, and your performance moving forward will determine whether you continue with the airline. Emily felt a flicker of relief. She hadn't been fired. Not yet. But it was close. Too close. Kelly's voice softened slightly. Look, I get it. This job is stressful. And sometimes, we get so caught up in doing things that we forget why we're here. But if you can't learn from this, then this isn't the job for you. Emily's chest tightened, but she nodded once more. I understand. Kelly exhaled, glancing toward the curtain. Good. Then prove it. The landing. A moment of reflection. As the plane descended, Emily sat quietly in the galley, lost in thought. She thought about what Laura had said, how this wasn't about fixing the past, but about proving she could be better in the future. She thought about Kelly's warning, how she had been given a chance, but that it wasn't a guarantee. And she thought about the elderly woman, how she had smiled despite what had happened, how she had told Emily that everyone makes mistakes. She had been given a rare gift, a second chance. But would she be able to make the most of it? The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to gather their things, murmuring about their plans in Miami. Emily knew she should be helping with disembarkation, but she hesitated. Then, as passengers started filing out, she caught sight of the elderly woman standing near the exit. She was moving slowly, gripping her carry-on, but there was something in her posture that surprised Emily. She was waiting for her. Emily took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Ma'am, she said, her voice softer this time. The elderly woman turned, smiling warmly. Yes, dear. Emily swallowed. Thank you. The woman's eyes crinkled slightly. For what? For forgiving me, Emily admitted. For not holding it against me. The woman chuckled, shaking her head. Oh dear. Forgiveness isn't about ignoring what happened. It's about choosing to see more than just a single mistake. Emily blinked. More. The woman nodded. You apologized. You tried to make it right. And that matters. But what will matter most is what you do next. Emily stared at her. Then slowly she nodded. I understand, she said, this time with certainty. The elderly woman patted her arm gently. Then go be better, dear. With that, she turned and stepped off the plane. Emily watched her go, feeling the strange mix of emotions swirl inside her. She had almost lost everything today. But she hadn't. She had a chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. A second chance, but not without consequences. The longest walk. The plane was empty now. The last of the passengers had disembarked. The crew had begun final checks, and the terminal outside was buzzing with new travelers ready to board their own flights. But Emily wasn't leaving the aircraft just yet. She stood in the galley, staring at the now vacant aisle, feeling the echoes of the day's events pressing down on her. She had apologized. The elderly woman had forgiven her. But that didn't change the fact that she had messed up. And now she had to face the consequences. Her name had already been flagged in the system. The report had been sent to corporate. And in less than an hour, she would be sitting in an office with the airline's HR department, answering for what had happened on Flight 382. A meeting like that didn't always end with a firing, but sometimes it did. Emily exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to steady herself. Kelly approached her from the front of the plane, clipboard in hand. "Time to go," she said. "HR is expecting you." Emily nodded, forcing herself to stand straight. She wasn't going to run from this. Not anymore. She followed Kelly off the plane, stepping into the bustling terminal where uniformed airline employees moved between gates. Luggage carts beeped as they maneuvered through the crowds, and exhausted travelers made their way to their next destinations. For a moment, she felt the overwhelming weight of it all. How small she was in the grand scheme of things. How easy it would be for the airline to replace her if they decided she wasn't fit for this job. "Come on," Kelly said, leading her toward the administrative offices past the security checkpoint. "Let's get this over with." Emily followed without a word. The HR meeting. Judgment Day. The HR office was sterile and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the airport outside. Emily sat in a stiff-backed chair across from Karen, the airline's HR representative, while Kelly sat beside her, arms crossed. Laura wasn't here. This was an official disciplinary meeting, and only senior management and HR were allowed to be present. Karen studied the report in front of her for a long moment before looking up. "Emily," she began, her tone neutral but firm. "We've reviewed the incident report from Flight 382, and we need to have a serious conversation about what happened." Emily nodded, keeping her hands folded in her lap. "I understand." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" she asked. "Because from what I've read, a very simple situation was mishandled to the point where it caused noticeable distress to a passenger and discomfort to others in the cabin." Emily swallowed hard but didn't argue. Karen continued, "This airline has built a reputation on service, on professionalism, on care. When our flight attendants fail to meet those expectations, it damages that reputation. Do you realize how many passengers witness these kinds of interactions and immediately take to social media? How fast one mistake can spread and make us look like we don't care about our customers?" Emily felt a pang of dread at that thought. Had someone posted about this? Had she become a viral story without even knowing it? I'm not making excuses," Emily said carefully. "I made a mistake. A big one. I didn't realize how dismissive I was being in the moment, but looking back, I can see how much I mishandled the situation." Karen leaned back in her chair, watching her. "I appreciate that you're taking responsibility. That's the only reason we're having this meeting instead of immediately terminating you." Emily's heart clenched at that. So she had come close to being fired. Karen sighed. "Look, I get it. You've been with us for 3 years. You don't have a history of complaints. But that doesn't mean you're above accountability. This can't happen again. Period." Emily nodded quickly. "It won't." "Good," Karen said. Then she glanced down at the paper in front of her. "Now here's what happens next. You're not being fired. For now. But you are being put on probation for 60 days. Emily stiffened. "Probation." Karen nodded. "For the next 2 months. Every flight you work will be monitored more closely. If there's any more complaints, or if we receive any indication that you're struggling with passenger interactions, you will be terminated. No second chances." Emily exhaled slowly. She had expected consequences. She had braced herself for the worst. But probation. That wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a warning that she was hanging onto this job by a thread. "You'll also be required to complete additional customer service and de-escalation training," Karen added. And you'll be reassigned to domestic flights only for the duration of your probation. Emily frowned. No international routes. No, Karen confirmed. International flights come with higher service expectations, and right now you need to prove you can handle the basics. That stung. She had worked hard to be assigned to long-haul international flights, to earn the experience and higher pay that came with them. And now she was back to square one. Do you understand these terms? Karen asked. Emily swallowed her pride and nodded. Yes, I understand. Karen glanced at Kelly. Anything you'd like to add? Kelly sighed. Only this. Emily, I do believe you can come back from this. But that's entirely up to you. You need to let go of whatever's been holding you back and focus on why you're here. If you can't do that, you don't belong in this job. Emily nodded again, her throat tight. I understand. Karen folded her hands together. All right. Then you'll receive an official notice of probation via email. Your next flight assignment will be sent to you within the next few days. The meeting was over. Emily had survived it. But she didn't feel relieved. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, trying not to fall. Reality sinks in. After the meeting, Emily stepped out into the terminal, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. 2 months. 2 months of proving herself. 2 months of walking on eggshells, knowing that one more mistake could end everything. It was terrifying. But more than that, it was humbling. She had let herself believe she was invincible in this job. That as long as she followed the rules and did what was expected, she didn't have to think about how she treated people. Now she knew better. She took a deep breath and walked toward the break room. She needed a moment to process everything. But as she stepped inside, she was surprised to find Laura sitting there, sipping a cup of coffee. Laura raised an eyebrow. Survived, huh? Emily exhaled. Barely. Laura smirked. Welcome to the world of learning the hard way. Emily shook her head, sitting across from her. I don't know if I can do this. Laura shrugged. You don't have a choice. You either learn from it, or you quit. Emily stared down at her hands. I don't want to quit. Good, Laura said simply. Then she leaned forward. Then prove it. Emily let out a slow breath. She had been given a second chance. But now she had to earn it. And she wasn't going to waste it. Redemption in the skies. The weight of probation. The first few days of Emily's probation felt like walking on a tightrope. One wrong move, and she would fall. Every flight she was assigned to was a short-haul domestic route, usually lasting no more than 2 hours. These flights didn't have the prestige or the glamour of international long-haul journeys, but Emily quickly realized something. Every flight, no matter the distance, was filled with people who expected care and professionalism, and she was being watched. Her supervisors monitored her performance closely. Other flight attendants, some supportive, others skeptical, were keeping an eye on her, waiting to see if she would mess up again. Even the passengers, though unaware of her probation, seemed to carry an unspoken expectation. Was she truly capable of being better? Or was she just trying to avoid getting fired? Emily didn't have the luxury of failing. She had 60 days to prove that she belonged in this job. And every single shift counted. First flight back, a chance to do better. Her first flight under probation was a simple route, Miami to Atlanta. A quick 90-minute trip, barely enough time for a full beverage service. But for Emily, it felt like the most important flight of her career. She was paired with a senior flight attendant named Jessica, one of the best in the airline. Jessica had been flying for over 10 years, and she carried herself with the kind of effortless confidence that Emily had always admired. But there was no warmth in her eyes when she greeted Emily that morning. So, you're the one on probation, Jessica said, her tone neutral. Emily felt the weight of those words. Yes. Jessica studied her for a moment before responding. All right, here's the deal. I don't babysit. You know your job, so do it right. And if I see you slipping, I won't cover for you. Emily nodded. Understood. The pressure was on. As the passengers boarded, she focused on the basics, greeting everyone warmly, helping with baggage, directing people to their seats. Nothing extraordinary, just doing her job. But as she moved through the cabin, she felt something different. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was watching people, noticing small things she would have ignored before. An elderly couple struggling with the overhead bin, a nervous-looking first-time flyer gripping the armrests, a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained. Before, she would have walked past them, assuming they would figure it out on their own. Now, she stopped. She helped the elderly couple stow their luggage. She reassured the nervous flyer that turbulence was nothing to fear. She knelt beside the mother and offered her an extra set of napkins for the toddler's spilled juice. It wasn't much, but it mattered. By the time they'd reached cruising altitude, Emily had done something she hadn't done in a long time. She had connected with the passengers. The real test, a moment of truth. Halfway through the flight, a call button chimed from seat 12B. Emily moved quickly, her heart beating faster than usual. Please don't let this be another mistake. Please don't let me screw this up. When she reached the seat, she found an elderly man, a different one this time, not the woman from Flight 382. But the moment felt eerily familiar. He looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly in his seat. "Sir, is everything all right?" Emily asked gently. The man cleared his throat. "I'm feeling a little lightheaded. I think I just need some water." Water. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Not again. Not this time. Without hesitation, she nodded. "Of course, sir. Stay right there. I'll get it for you right away." She ran to the galley. She didn't walk. She didn't wait. She didn't think about efficiency or whether it was the right time for beverage service. She just acted. Less than 30 seconds later, she returned with a cold bottle of water, handing it to the man with steady hands. He took a sip, sighed, and smiled. "Thank you, dear. That's much better." Emily smiled back, relief washing over her. "If you need anything else, just let me know." She turned to walk away, but as she did, she caught Jessica watching her from the galley. For the first time since they met, there was no skepticism in Jessica's eyes. There was approval, maybe even respect. Emily didn't need praise, but that felt like the first step toward redemption. The cabin notices the change. As the flight continued, Emily felt the difference in the air. Passengers seemed at ease with her. When she offered snacks, people actually smiled at her. When she helped a man adjust his seat, he thanked her with genuine appreciation. And when she checked back on the elderly man who had asked for water, he patted her arm and said, "You've got a good heart, young lady." Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat. This was what she had forgotten. It wasn't about following the script perfectly. It wasn't about being the fastest or the most efficient. It was about people. Caring about them. Listening to them. Making them feel seen. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was doing the job she had signed up for. And it felt right. Landing with a new perspective. When they landed in Atlanta, Emily helped passengers disembark, saying goodbye to each one with a smile. It was a small thing. But it was different now. Before probation, she had done it because it was required. Now she meant it. Jessica was the last one off the plane, and as she grabbed her bag, she turned to Emily. "You did good today," she said. Emily blinked. "I did." Jessica nodded. "You actually saw the passengers today. That's what makes the difference." Emily let out a slow breath. "Thanks." Jessica smirked. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got a long way to go." Emily knew she was right. One good flight didn't erase the past, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Flight 382. Hope. She wasn't just trying to keep her job anymore. She was trying to be better. And maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. The road to redemption. A different kind of silence. As Emily exited the plane, walking alongside the rest of the crew toward the airline's break room, she noticed something odd. For the first time since being placed on probation, no one was whispering about her. No sidelong glances, no murmured judgments. Just normal conversation. It wasn't because people had forgotten what had happened on Flight 382. They hadn't. But something had shifted. She wasn't just the flight attendant who screwed up anymore. She was the flight attendant trying to make it right. And that made all the difference. Facing the crew, earning back their trust. The break room was filled with other attendants from different flights, some finishing shifts, others waiting to board their next assignments. Emily felt their eyes on her as she stepped inside. Some looked neutral. Some still looked skeptical. But one thing was clear. They were watching. Jessica, who had been walking beside her, grabbed a coffee from the machine and leaned against the counter. "You're still standing," she remarked casually. Emily smirked. For now. Jessica took a sip of her coffee. "You did good today," she repeated. "That's one flight down. But you know the real test isn't just one shift." Emily nodded. "I know. I have to keep proving it." Jessica studied her for a moment, then tilted her head toward a group of flight attendants in the corner. "You should talk to them." Emily followed Jessica's gaze and immediately recognized two of the attendants, Mark and Sylvia. They had both been on Flight 382. They had both seen her mistake. Emily hesitated. She didn't know what to say. She had been so focused on proving herself to passengers that she hadn't even thought about earning back the trust of her own team. But Jessica nudged her. "Go." Emily took a breath and made her way over. Mark saw her first. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he didn't look away. Sylvia, on the other hand, crossed her arms. "Well, if it isn't probation, girl," Sylvia said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Emily winced but didn't let it shake her. "Look, I know you both saw what happened. And I know I don't exactly have a great reputation right now." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Understatement." Emily exhaled. "I'm not here to make excuses. I messed up. I should have handled that situation better. And I didn't. But I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to make sure it never happens again." Sylvia's expression remained unimpressed. "We'll see." Mark, however, nodded slowly. "I respect that you're owning it," he said. "But just so you know, a lot of people don't come back from something like that." Emily swallowed. "I know." Sylvia sighed. "All right. You get one chance. But don't expect people to just forget." "I don't," Emily said firmly. Mark studied her for another second, then extended a hand. "Good luck, probation girl." Emily smiled, shaking his hand. "Thanks." As she walked back toward Jessica, she felt a little lighter. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it was a start. The unexpected call. Just as Emily was about to leave the break room, her phone buzzed. Karen, HR. Her stomach flipped. This couldn't be good. She quickly answered. "Hello, Emily." Karen's voice came through the line, calm but firm. "I need you to come to my office." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. Did something happen? "We received a call from a passenger," Karen said. "About you." Emily's heart stopped. A passenger? Had someone from today's flight filed a complaint? Had she already failed? Karen sighed. "Just come to my office." Now. Emily barely muttered a "yes, ma'am" before hanging up. Jessica, who had clearly overheard, raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. But I think I'm in trouble." Jessica set down her coffee. "Want me to come with you?" Emily hesitated. She wanted backup. She wanted someone to tell her everything would be fine. But this was something she had to face alone. "No," she said. "I have to handle this." Jessica gave her a nod of approval. "Good luck." Emily swallowed her fear and left. The Office of Truth. Emily arrived at the HR office within minutes, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Karen was sitting at her desk, flipping through what looked like a printed email. She gestured for Emily to sit. Emily sat. Karen set the paper down. "You look like you're expecting bad news." Emily forced a laugh. "Aren't I?" Karen gave her a long look. Then, to Emily's utter shock, she smiled. "The passenger who called wasn't filing a complaint," Karen said. "They were giving you a compliment." Emily blinked. "What?" Karen nodded. "An elderly man from your flight today called the airline to say that one of our attendants showed him exceptional kindness and care when he wasn't feeling well." Emily's breath hitched. "The man in 12B." Karen smirked. "So you do know what I'm talking about." Emily felt a rush of relief and disbelief all at once. A passenger had actually called to praise her. Karen leaned forward. "He said you were patient, quick to respond, and genuinely concerned for his well-being. He said you made the flight a little brighter." His words, not mine. Emily didn't know what to say. Karen studied her for a moment before speaking again. "This doesn't erase what happened on Flight 382, she said, "but it does show that you're making an effort." Emily nodded. "I am." Karen sighed. "All right. I'll make a note of the call in your file. It won't remove your probation, but it's a step in the right direction. A step in the right direction." That was all Emily needed. "Thank you," she said. Karen nodded. "Keep it up." The road ahead. As Emily left the HR office, her mind was still spinning. She had spent weeks fearing that every interaction, every moment on a flight, would be another mistake waiting to happen. She had been so caught up in proving herself that she hadn't realized something important. The passengers didn't need her to be perfect. They just needed her to care. She had made a mistake on Flight 382. But mistakes didn't define people. What they did after the mistake did. And she was going to make sure that every flight from now on was one that she could be proud of. As she stepped back into the airport terminal, she let out a deep breath. The road ahead wasn't easy, but she was walking it. One flight at a time. One passenger at a time. And finally, one step closer to earning her place in the skies again. Redemption takes flight. The first real victory. The days following the HR meeting were a blur of early mornings, back-to-back flights, and constant self-reflection. Emily had always known the job was demanding, but now every shift felt like a test. But she welcomed it. She had made her mistake. Now she had to prove, through actions, not words, that she had learned from it. As she checked her new flight schedule, something caught her attention. She had been reassigned to a slightly longer route, Dallas to New York. Not international, not glamorous, but it was progress. Probation had limited her to short-haul flights at first, but now she was slowly being trusted with longer routes again, and she wasn't going to waste this chance. The flight that defined her. Flight 715 from Dallas to New York was packed. Every seat was filled, and the energy in the terminal before takeoff was loud, restless. Emily could feel the tension in the air. There were business travelers rushing to meetings, families trying to keep their kids entertained, and elderly passengers who moved carefully, some looking overwhelmed by the crowds. In the past, she would have focused solely on speed and efficiency, making sure the passengers were in their seats, overhead bins were closed, and everything was on schedule. But today, she focused on something else. The passengers themselves. She helped an elderly man adjust his seatbelt, making sure he was comfortable before takeoff. She reassured a nervous flyer, cracking a small joke that made them smile. She carried a mother's heavy carry-on when she saw her struggling with her 2 young children. None of it was required of her. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just doing her job. She was making the experience better for the people around her. And for the first time in weeks, she wasn't working out of fear. She was working out of purpose. The emergency had changed everything. The flight had been smooth for the first 2 hours. No turbulence, no difficult passengers, no major issues. Emily was feeling confident, maybe even hopeful, when she heard the chime of the emergency call button from row 8. She moved quickly. When she reached the seat, she saw a middle-aged man clutching his chest, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Her stomach dropped. A medical emergency. The worst-case scenario on any flight. Passengers were starting to panic, whispering to each other. But Emily didn't freeze. She had been trained for this. She immediately knelt beside the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man nodded weakly. "Do you have any medical conditions? Any history of heart problems?" His wife, sitting beside him, answered instead. "He has high blood pressure. He took his medication before the flight, but he said he wasn't feeling well earlier." Emily turned to another flight attendant. "Call the captain. We need to check if there's a doctor on board." The other attendant nodded and rushed to the intercom. Meanwhile, Emily reached for the emergency medical kit, her hand steady. The man's breathing was still labored. She needed to act fast. She raised the intercom to her lips. "Attention, passengers. If there is a medical professional on board, please press your call button or make yourself known immediately." A few tense seconds passed. Then, a man in his 50s, wearing a dark suit, stood up from row 12. "I'm a cardiologist," he said. Emily felt a surge of relief. The doctor moved quickly, checking the man's vitals while Emily assisted. "His pulse is weak," the doctor said. "We need to get him hydrated and keep him as calm as possible." Emily immediately grabbed a bottle of water, twisting the cap open and offering it to the man in small sips. Another flight attendant arrived with the oxygen mask, which Emily carefully placed over the man's face. The doctor turned to her. "You did good," he said. Emily barely registered the words. She wasn't thinking about her probation. She wasn't thinking about her past mistake. She was only thinking about making sure this man made it through the flight safely. The landing, a different kind of recognition. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, the situation had stabilized. The man's color had returned, and he was able to breathe more comfortably. The doctor had stayed by his side, but Emily checked in frequently, making sure he had everything he needed. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't faltered. She had acted. As the plane touched down, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical team waiting at the gate for our passenger in row 8. We'd like to thank everyone for their patience, and a special thanks to our flight attendants, who handled the situation with professionalism and care." Emily felt something in her chest tighten. This time, she had done it right. As paramedics boarded the plane, she stepped aside to let them assist the man. Before he was wheeled out, he turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Emily smiled. "Get some rest, sir." As he was taken off the plane, Emily finally allowed herself a deep breath. And when she turned, she saw something she hadn't expected. Passengers, several of them, were watching her, but not with judgment, with respect. A few even clapped. She blinked, surprised. And then, Jessica stepped beside her, arms crossed, smirking. "Guess you're not just probation girl anymore." Emily let out a soft, relieved laugh. Maybe she wasn't. The final decision. A few days later, Emily received an email from HR. She stared at the subject line for a long time before finally opening it. Subject: Probation Status Update. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. Then she froze. Her probation was being lifted. Not after 60 days. After only 30. Because of passenger reports. Because of crew recommendations. Because she had earned it. Emily exhaled, her hands shaking slightly. She had thought that one mistake would define her forever, but it hadn't. She had taken responsibility. She had worked to be better. And now, she was officially back. Epilogue. The flight that proved everything. A week after her probation was lifted, Emily was assigned to a long-haul international flight, her first one since the incident. It wasn't just another flight. It was proof. Proof that she had come back from the lowest point in her career. Proof that she had earned the right to be here. As she stood by the gate, greeting passengers, she felt something different this time. Confidence. Not the kind that came from perfection. The kind that came from growth. She had made a mistake. She had faced the consequences. And she had proven herself. For the first time since Flight 382, Emily didn't feel like she was trying to be a great flight attendant. She was one. And as the passengers boarded, she smiled, genuinely, this time. This was her second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it.